Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Furlong and you're watching Biochemistry Part 1. Biochemistry is an extremely important part of this class. We're going to be taking a look at molecules that make up all living things. And we're going to be talking about these molecules over and over and over again. So this is something that I'm really going to expect that you have down pat, not only for this chapter, but for the chapters that are going to continue on after this. These molecules are considered to be organic compounds. Oftentimes when we think about what organic means, we think of food that we can get into the grocery store. You know, that they are organic fruits and organic vegetables. But in science, when we talk about organic compounds, what we really mean are compounds that contain carbon. Now, not every molecule that has carbon is considered organic. You also have to be found in a living or once living organism. Now, we're focusing on the living organisms. They are all made up of organic compounds, but certainly things like coal and oil and natural gas, those are also considered organic because they come from a once living organism, plants that had lived millions of years ago during the Carboniferous period and have decomposed into those products of today. All organic compounds are considered macromolecules, which literally means giant molecules. And I'm talking, these are huge. Oxygen is what, O2. It's 2 atoms big. Carbon dioxide, CO2, that's only 3 atoms big. We're talking about molecules that can be thousands of atoms in size. So these are very large molecules. And they all have some things in common. For instance, all of these larger macromolecules are made from smaller organic molecules that are bonded together. And here we see 4 different say smaller organic molecules that when we put them together form into a nice larger molecule. These smaller molecules, we're going to give them a generic term. We're going to refer to them as monomers. Whereas when we put them together, they are then referred to as polymers. So we see that Greek prefix mono meaning one, poly meaning many. The smaller molecules are made up of one molecule, the monomers. When we put monomers together, we then have a polymer. Now there are 4 types of organic compounds that we're going to be looking at this year. There's certainly others than these 4, but these are the 4 that we're going to take a look at. Carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and the nucleic acids. In this video, we're just going to look at the first 2, carbohydrates and lipids. In the next video, we'll study proteins and nucleic acids. So carbohydrates are more commonly known as the sugars. So whenever you have something that's nice, sweet tasting, and there's sugar in there, it's a carbohydrate. The monomer, or the building block of a carbohydrate, is called a monosaccharide. And there we can see the structural formula for a monosaccharide. This happens to be glucose, and we can count up all the number of carbons that are present in that molecule. We can see that, for instance, this is C6H12O6. There's 6 carbon atoms. There's 12 hydrogen atoms, and there's 6 oxygen atoms. This one is called glucose, and this is the basic building block of many of our carbohydrates. And when we take a look at this, you should be able to recognize this as a monosaccharide just by looking at the structure of it. So for instance, here we see a nice hexagon-shaped structure. This is a shorthand way of showing a monosaccharide. And there's other monosaccharides. I do want you to know glucose, the other is fructose. And as you can see, there's a slightly different shape. Instead of a hexagon shape, it's a pentagon shape. But these 2 are 2 of the more common types of monomers of carbohydrates that you're going to come across. Glucose we'll talk about a lot. Fructose, of course, is found in things like high fructose corn syrup. Now, if we were to take those 2 monomers and put them together, well, then we get what's called a disaccharide. So a disaccharide, 2 monosaccharides bonded together. Di is the Greek prefix for 2, and actually the saccharide part means sweet. This is a molecule known as sucrose. Sucrose is one glucose and one fructose molecule bonded together. This is a name I want you to also recognize because sucrose is your regular old table sugar. What you put on your cereal in the morning is good old sucrose. If we take a whole bunch of these monosaccharides and they bond together, it will form a polysaccharide. Now there's three polysaccharides that I do want you to know the name of. For instance, you should know what starch is. Now starch, of course, is a series of monosaccharides. There you can see all these little hexagon shapes. Each one of those is a different glucose molecule, and they're all bonded together. Starch is typically made in plants. So this is how plants store their excess glucose that they make. Glycogen, there we go, is similar to starch, only this is made by animals. So for instance, we don't store our excess sugar as starch, we store our excess sugar as glycogen. Now finally, a third type is cellulose. Now notice how cellulose, the monosaccharides, are all lined up real nice and neat. All right, again, this is made by plants. We don't make cellulose. We can eat cellulose. Cellulose is found in the cell walls of plants, but we can't digest them. So that's why we might refer to this as fiber. Starch is made from plants. Where do we get starch in our diet? Well, things like bread and pastas. Any type of grain. This is coming from the plant's storage of their excess glucose that they made during photosynthesis, and we can get quite a bit of energy from that. Glycogen can be found in the muscle tissue of animals, so when you're eating some meat, you're going to get some carbohydrates in there. Cellulose, we can't eat this. We don't get any nutrition from it. It's typically, we call it fiber, but we find it in the cell walls of plants. So for instance, wood is made up of cellulose, and because of the structure of cellulose, it makes a very strong structure. So strong, in fact, that we build our homes out of it. Now the function for a carbohydrate is primarily one thing, and that is it provides living organisms with energy. 95% of all of our energy comes from carbohydrates. Now, I hope I'm making myself clear on this point, that I really want you to know what the function of carbohydrates are. And again, anything that we do requires energy. Where is that energy coming from? It's coming from the carbohydrates that are in our diet. Okay, that's enough of that. The second type of organic compounds are lipids. Now, lipids are made up of two different building blocks. These are more commonly what we call the fats. And their two monomers are glycerol and fatty acids. So as we can see, this shaded in part over here, made up of 3 carbons, there's some hydrogens and some oxygen, that is the glycerol. Now attached to the glycerol are fatty acids, and these are long chains of carbon atoms. There's a whole bunch of hydrogens that are attached to it. Typically what we'll see are 1, 2, 3 fatty acids that can be attached to the glycerol molecule. Now, as you notice, if you look at these these 3 fatty acids, they differ in several ways. One fatty acid is a little bit longer than the other. Look at that bottom fatty acid, and it's bent. Right? The difference here is that bottom fatty acid, we see that there's a double covalent bond between the carbon atoms. So right here, there's a double bond. Kind of hard to see on this, but there's 2 lines, meaning that these carbon atoms are sharing 2 electrons, which shows us that there's no hydrogens down below. These are 2 different types of fatty acids. Now they have names. We call the first 2 are called saturated fats, which means that they only have single covalent bonds between the carbon atoms, versus that bottom one, which is an unsaturated fat, that has at least 1 double bond between the carbon atoms. Now there certainly could be more than 1 double bond, but there has to be at least 1 in order to to be considered unsaturated. Well, what's the difference between these two? Well, the saturated fats are known as the bad fats. So for instance, here we see things like animal fat found in bacon. Oh, but bacon is so good. The unsaturated fats, those are known as the good fats. Those types of fats are a little bit healthier for us. Our body knows how to metabolize that. Now, the function of lipids is to basically do two things. One is it stores energy. Yeah, glucose provides us with a lot of energy, and again, 95% of our energy comes from glucose, but it's not an effective way of storing energy. So we'll store our excess energy in the form of lipids. We get more calories per gram of lipid than we do in carbohydrate. It also acts as an insulator, so especially for animals that live in cold environments, having a nice thick layer of lipids, a thick layer of fats, helps to keep them warm. Now, there are different types of lipids. The one that we looked at is called a triglyceride. That is the most common type of lipid, and of course tri means three, which has 3 fatty acids attached to that glycerol molecule. The second type is a phospholipid. We'll talk more about phospholipids later. But notice that they only have 2 fatty acids attached to them and a phosphate group. These are going to be found in things like cell membranes of cells, and we'll talk more about that later. But this third type doesn't look like the other 2 types of lipids. These are known as the steroids. And as you can see, these steroids, they will have a series of molecules, and then we see this kind of crazy looking antenna thing on top of it that provide a whole other class of molecules. They are technically considered a lipid, even though they're not made up of fatty acids and glycerol. They do things like they make hormones in us. Things like earwax is considered a steroid, so not a real pleasant thing to think about here to end this video. All right, so those are the first 2. In the next video, we'll be taking a look at the next 2 types of organic compounds, the proteins and nucleic acids, and I can't wait to get started on that. Thanks.